Hello and welcome back to HalTech TV. Today we are looking at answering one of the biggest questions in terms of water cooling, and that is, what fans should you use with the specific heatsink that you have, or what heatsink and fan combination should I use? So really what it is a buyer's guide to fans used in water cooling. And I'll answer that in just a second, because there's two main ways that you can go about doing it. When looking for a fan for your computer, people generally look at two main things in terms of the specification, and that is the CFM rating and the noise rating, because it's sort of common sense that the more airflow it pushes through, the higher it'll perform, and you want it to run quiet. But when you're looking for a fan for a radiator, and you can apply this to heatsinks as well for air cooling for your CPU and such, you've got to look at one more thing, and that is static pressure. Now, you have to look at this because what you're doing is you're taking the fan, and instead of just getting it to blow air through and sort of pull air or push air out of the case or in the case or whatever, you're putting it up against something which is obstructing the airflow, and that means that if it's got a low static pressure, it's not going to perform as well, because it can't push as much air through an obstructed path as one with a higher static pressure can. So in general, a fan with a higher static pressure will work better for your radiator / heatsink than one with a lower static pressure, but it still isn't that simple. Okay, so I've got two fans here for examples. I've got the NF P12 PWM and the NF F12 PWM. Now the F12 is the focused flow design, the static pressure fan by Noctua, and the P12 is the performance fan. This is what you would class as Noctua's normal, just standard performance fan, and the F12 would be sort of the fan designed for heatsinks. Now, like I said, you look at CFM. These both literally have the same CFM. For the F12, it is 93.4, and for the P12, it is 92.3. Now, again, noise is still important, and the P12 runs at 19.8 decibels, whereas the F12 runs at 22.4, so the F12 is slightly louder while being designed for radiators and heatsinks, but what you do see is an increase in static pressure, a huge increase. So the F12 is 2.61mm H2O compared to the P12's 1.68. So what you can see right there is that while the F12 is still pushing through a whole amount of air, is like, I think it was slightly more than the P12 actually, it does have a huge raise in its static pressure performance. But it is slightly louder, and it's what you can tell from that is that you don't have to lose performance from the other categories to have the static pressure, and it's two fans that are pushing through the same amount of air might not be as equal when it comes to static pressure. So what you do need to do is look at all of them: noise, CFM and static pressure. Now what I'm going to do now is go through the types of heatsinks and / radiators that you get, and the three things that you need to look at on them, and then what I'll go through is I'll go through and tell you what types of fans work best with what in terms of the heatsink and fan combinations, because I think I said at the start there's two main combinations to look at, and if you wait till the end, you'll see that it isn't that complicated, and it's quite simple when it comes to the combinations. Onto radiators / heatsinks, you have the three main things to look at when looking at the heatsinks. Two of them are the most important. One is still important, but it's not always applicable when it comes to radiators. There is a few radiators out there which generally, you see it and then it helps, and it sort of changes the general rule when it comes to the fan and radiator combo, and I will talk about that at the end when I'm talking about the combos. But the three things you need to look at is the thickness of the radiator, whether it's a 30mm thick, 60mm thick and 80mm thick. That is going to tell you partially how much obstruction of airflow there is. And the other thing, again, which is the main factor, is the fins per inch on the heat sinks. So that is going to tell you how many fins there are per inch, how much obstruction there is of airflow caused by the radiator. And the third, like I said, not always applicable, but this is the thickness of the fins. A lot of them, there's a general sort of average. There's an average thickness when it comes to the fins, but there is some radiators out there that sort of they break the general rule and they have a different thickness while being high fin per inch and such. But yes, so I'll go on and talk about the combinations of thickness, fins per inch and static pressure of the fan. We're going to split it up into two sort of scenarios, two opposite ends of the spectrum scenarios, and this is going to be one with a high thickness, an 80mm thick radiator with a 30 plus fins per inch rating, and with an average fin thickness rating. What you're going to see here is a high obstruction of airflow. This means no matter how good your fan is for CFM, no matter how much RPM you get, how high the RPM rating is, sorry, if it's got a low static pressure, the performance of that fan will be severely reduced. It won't be able to push that much airflow through, and the air will almost be sort of pushed back out through the fan, sort of pushed backwards, because it won't be able to get that much airflow through compared to one with a high static pressure. And like I said before, with the NFP12 and the NFF12 PWM fans, the static pressure will definitely be a big factor. For example, you put a P12 on this fan, the performance of your whole water cooling system will be nowhere near as good as compared to if you put the NFF12 PWM fan on, because of that static pressure. That F12 will be able to push through a whole ton more air through this radiator due to its capability of getting that air and forcing it through. So that's scenario one. If you have a thick radiator with a high fins per inch, you want a high static pressure, as high as static pressure as you can possibly go when it comes to fans. CFM is still important, but the main thing you need to look at is static pressure. Now obviously I'm going to say throughout this, you're not really going to want to go for one with a high noise rating. Noise rating will always be in your mind, but when it comes to CFM versus static pressure, in this particular scenario, static pressure is the main importance. Scenario 2. Scenario 2 is a 30mm thick radiator with a 20 minus fin per inch rating. With this, you've got to still think, well, static pressure is still important because you've got that radiator there, because you've got that obstruction there, but the importance of it isn't as much as it was with scenario 1, because you've got less obstruction. Now in this case, static pressure, yes, it's slightly important, but CFM is the main importance, because that fan doesn't need to have as high a static pressure rating. The CFM rating is sort of prioritized because it can push the air through, and the higher the CFM rating, the more air obviously it'll be able to push through. But you've got to still remember, you don't want to buy a fan with a really low static pressure rating, because that's when it's going to have problems. So in this case, an average static pressure rating, for example that NFP12 PWM, the static pressure rating on that isn't bad. that it's actually quite a good pressure rating, seeing as the fan's not designed for static pressure. For example, say, you know, that P12 PWM fan would be a perfect fan for this scenario, because it's got a good static pressure rating but a high CFM rating as well. So for a low fin per inch, small thickness radiator, you want a high CFM with a good static pressure rating. Now I'm going to go and talk about the little bits in the middle and the differences. For example, the fin thickness differences with some radiators out there. Okay, so this is kind of where the two scenarios aren't anything like what you are using. So say for example you have a 60mm thick with a low fin per inch heatsink, or you have some of the radiators that have been released not too long ago that have a high fin per inch, but the actual fin thickness is almost halved. So the obstruction is almost like it would be with the lower fin per inch. So what you've really got to do is you've got to compare a lot of the heat sinks and sort of figure out how much obstruction you're actually going to get from this heat sink. And now what I would recommend is, if you're sort of stuck in the middle, if you sort of, like I said, have a 60mm thick radiator with a low fin per inch, 20 minus low fin per inch rating, what I would tend to do here is I would tend to not prioritise either CFM or static pressure. I would tend to go with the higher static pressure fan, but maybe put a voltage reducer or a PWM limiter. So I'll take this fan and use it as an example again. I take this NFF12 PWM fan and I'd use the ultra low noise adapter that comes with it, reducing the RPM from 1500 to 1200. Now what this would do is, yes, it lowers the static pressure, and yes, it lowers the CFM, but it also lowers the noise. But at the end of the day, because it's a high CFM, high static pressure fan, because both of them are so high, and it is a louder fan than, say, the P12, you are still getting a higher static pressure, so you're still getting a good static pressure, you're still getting a high CFM, but the noise is reduced. Because the static pressure fans are generally kind of a bit louder than lower static pressure fans, and higher CFM fans again are a bit louder than lower CFM fans, because a lot of them generally have to have a higher RPM, they have to spin faster to produce that amount of airflow. So I tend to go with one of the higher static pressure fans and it's sort of limit it a bit, hold it back a bit with, in Noxia's case, the ultra low noise adapter. What you generally have to do is compare the fins per inch, the thickness, the fin thickness, and then figure out from that, like I said, the scenario 2, scenario 1, and sort of figure out what is best for you. I hope that helped, and it's time to say goodbye. So there we have it. That is the guide to the types of fans you want to use when using them with a specific type of radiator in your water cooling loop, or like I said, applied with the air cooling on your heatsink / CPU cooler, blah blah blah. If you haven't already, don't forget to head over to the HalTech TV website. There's a lot of content on there that you won't find anywhere else in the HalTech TV network. And while you're over there, don't forget to bookmark it in your browser. If you have any questions or product review requests, use the questions / requests section of the website, as that's where your questions and requests will get answered or listed as a possible product review. If you have any business contact requests, but any business leads, use the email provided. Links are in the description box below for everything that I've said just now. But But other than that, I'm HalThompson. Don't forget to subscribe, do everything I asked you to do before, and goodbye.